Everyone around you has already figured it out, or at least that is what it looks like from where you are standing. And the question you will not say out loud is the one that visits you every time another person your age announces something you have not reached yet. Am I already too late? You have been counting for a while now, not out loud, because saying it out loud makes it more real than you can currently afford. But in the quiet moments, the ones that arrive in the gap between finishing one obligation and finding the energy to begin the next one, you have been running the comparison. Your age against their achievement, your current position against where you believed you would be by now. The mental arithmetic never quite comes out in your favor, and the specific discomfort it produces is not exactly jealousy, though there is an element of that in it. It is something quieter and more personal than jealousy. It is the suspicion that the math is not wrong, that you are in some real and meaningful way behind, that the timeline you once held in your head as a reasonable expectation has passed without producing what you expected it to produce, and the window for what you wanted is not closing. It has already closed, and you simply have not fully acknowledged it yet. This is what you are carrying, not loudly, not in a way that most people around you can see, but consistently, with the specific weight of something that has been present long enough to begin to feel like a fact about who you are rather than a circumstance you are in. I want to tell you something before we go further, not to make you feel better, because comfortable feeling is not the same as useful understanding. I want to tell you something precise. The personality type that succeeds late is not the type that failed to succeed on time. It is a specific, documentable, psychologically coherent pattern of development that produces outcomes the early success model simply cannot generate. And if you recognize yourself in what follows, not because you want to, but because it is accurate, then what you have been calling delay has a different name. It has always had a different name. You simply have not been given it yet. Here is the perspective shift that almost no one in your life has offered you, because it requires a different framework than the one most people operate from. And most people do not have access to a different framework because they have never needed one. The framework most people use for evaluating success is linear. You identify a destination, you move toward it. The speed of your movement and the earliness of your arrival are the primary metrics of your competence and your worth. This framework is not without its uses. It describes a real pattern that works for a real subset of human beings operating in specific contexts where linear progression is genuinely what the situation rewards, but it is not a universal framework, it is a particular one, and it has been presented to you as though it were universal, which means that every time your actual developmental pattern diverged from the linear model, you had only one available interpretation: that you were failing. Carl Jung spent decades building the case that human psychological development does not follow a single pattern, and that the linear model, the one that rewards early identification of direction, rapid movement, consistent output, describes one type of development while systematically misidentifying a second type as deficiency. The second type is not slower in the pejorative sense. It is deeper, and depth, in the specific way Jung meant it, takes longer to develop than speed does, not because the person developing it is less capable, but because what is developing is genuinely more complex, more layered, and ultimately more difficult to produce. You have not been failing to arrive on the linear path. You have been building something that the linear path does not have the architecture to contain. The psychological grounding for this requires going to a place most conversations about late success never visit, because it is more demanding and more honest than the usual reassurance. Jung identified what he called the individuation process, a long, non-linear, frequently disorienting journey through which a person moves from the constructed self, the identity assembled from external requirements and early adaptations, toward the genuine self, the identity that emerges from the integration of everything the constructed version was required to suppress. He believed this process could not be rushed, not because the person undergoing it was moving slowly, but because the material being worked with was genuinely resistant to speed. You cannot hurry the integration of your shadow, the parts of yourself that were pushed underground because they did not fit the version of you that generated safety and approval in your early environments. You cannot accelerate the process by which a person disentangles what they were required to be from what they actually are. These processes have their own timing, and that timing is almost never aligned with the cultural timeline that assigns milestones to decades. Separately, research into what developmental psychologists call crystallized intelligence, a specific kind of knowing that comes from accumulated experience rather than raw cognitive speed, shows a consistent pattern. It peaks later than fluid intelligence, sometimes significantly later, and it produces a different quality of output, not a smaller output, a denser one. The person who has spent years in the difficult, unacknowledged work of becoming genuinely themselves rather than efficiently performing a constructed version of themselves tends to produce work that has a quality. The early achiever's work rarely contains the quality of someone who knows not just what they are doing but why, and who has done the interior work to ensure that the why is actually theirs. This is not consolation. It is a structural description of a different developmental architecture, yours. Now let us talk about the burden honestly, because the burden is real, and pretending otherwise would be a betrayal of the trust you extended by staying with this long enough to get here. The late success personality type does not simply experience a delayed arrival. They experience something more corrosive than delay. They experience the sustained, accumulating pressure of a world that does not recognize what they are building, because what they are building is not yet visible, and invisible building looks from the outside identical to not building at all. This is the wound inside the wound. The early achiever who is struggling still has the structure of their achievement to point to. The evidence exists externally, and other people can confirm it. The late developer who is doing the most important work of their life, the slow, interior, frequently unglamorous work of genuine individuation, he too has nothing to show for it during the years when it matters most socially. Nothing that fits the timeline other people are using to evaluate them. Nothing that satisfies the comparison their family runs, or their colleagues run, or the part of themselves that absorbed the linear framework early enough that it now runs the comparison automatically, without asking permission. The loneliness of this is specific and almost never accurately named. It is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of being in a crowd of people who are all looking at a scoreboard, seeing your name lower than the others, and not being able to say to any of them that you are playing a different game, not because you chose to, but because the game you are suited for has different rules, a different timeline, and rewards that the scoreboard they are all watching was not designed to measure. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I continue, because this next part matters, and it requires you to have felt the weight of what I just described rather than moved past it. There is a specific kind of person this pattern tends to produce, and describing them requires precision rather than flattery, because flattery will not help you, and this person's existence in the world is too genuinely necessary for the description to be diluted into inspiration content. The late success type tends to have a relationship with depth that the early achiever genuinely cannot access, not because of any moral superiority, but because of what they were required to develop in the absence of early external confirmation. When the world does not tell you that you are winning, you are forced, if you do not collapse entirely, and many people do collapse, and that collapse is also worth acknowledging, you are forced to develop an internal relationship with your own work that is simply not available to the person whose external validation arrived before their interior was fully formed. You develop a tolerance for uncertainty that other people find almost incomprehensible. You develop the capacity to work without applause, to build without confirmation, to invest in directions that have not yet produced visible returns. These are not small capacities. They are among the rarest and most valuable that a human being can possess, and they are produced specifically and almost exclusively by the experience of having gone without external confirmation long enough that external confirmation stopped being the primary source of fuel. The work starts to run on something else, something quieter, less dramatic, and significantly more durable. Jung would call it contact with the self, the deep, integrated, genuinely individual center of the psyche. And what gets built from that contact tends to outlast and occasionally outperform almost everything built from the faster and louder sources of motivation that early success provides. This is not romantic. It is structural. It is a description of what the architecture of delayed development tends to produce when the person inside it does not abandon the process before it completes. But here is where I have to stop being theoretical and speak to you as directly as I can manage, because there is a shadow side to this that most conversations about late blooming leave entirely unaddressed, and leaving it unaddressed would make everything I have said so far quietly dishonest. Not everyone who has not yet succeeded on the linear timeline is a late bloomer in the meaningful sense. Some people are genuinely working on something real, building something that requires time the external world world has not yet confirmed, doing the interior and exterior work that the late success pattern demands. And some people are using the framework of the late bloomer as a comfortable way to avoid the specific and uncomfortable question of whether they are actually building anything at all. Delay and avoidance look identical from the inside when you are inside one of them and hoping it is the other. I cannot tell you which one you are in, but you can. And the signal that distinguishes them is not the presence or absence of external results. And that is exactly the wrong metric for someone in this situation. The signal is the presence or absence of genuine interior work. Are you actually doing the thing? Not performing the intention, not planning the attempt, not constructing a narrative about why the timing has not been right. Actually doing the work, however slowly, however quietly, however without any current confirmation that it will eventually produce what you are hoping it will produce. If the answer is yes, then the delay is real, and this framework describes you with genuine accuracy. If the answer is more complicated than yes, then the most important thing this video can offer you is not the comfort of the late bloomer framework. It is the invitation to look honestly at the difference between the two, because you deserve that honesty more than you deserve the comfort. Here is what the research on late achievers consistently finds when it strips away the narrative and looks only at the pattern. There is a specific quality that distinguishes the people who do eventually produce significant work after a period of extended delay from the people who do not. It is not talent, though talent is present. It is not intelligence, though intelligence is present. It is the quality Jung might describe as fidelity to the interior, the sustained, frequently costly, often invisible commitment to the thing they are actually building rather than to the performance of being someone who is building it. The late achiever tends to have spent years being shaped by their material rather than simply producing it. They have allowed their subject, their craft, their area of genuine depth to change them, to require things from them, to send them back to the beginning multiple times, to reveal layers of complexity they were not initially equipped to handle, and they kept going back rather than settling for the version they could have produced earlier if they had been willing to accept a shallower result. This is the distinguishing feature, not the delay itself, the quality of engagement with the material during the delay. And this is also, not coincidentally, why the work they eventually produce tends to have a density and an authenticity that audiences and readers and the people who encounter it can feel before they can name, because it was built by someone who was genuinely changed by the building rather than simply skilled at producing output. Now I want to give you something practical, because practical matters, and a script that leaves you feeling deeply understood without giving you anything to do with the understanding has wasted your time in a particular way that I find genuinely objectionable. The first practical thing is a reframing that requires consistent repetition before it sticks, because the linear framework is deeply installed and does not yield to a single correction. Every time you run the comparison, your position against their position, your timeline against the cultural timeline, interrupt the comparison at the moment you notice it, and replace the single-axis evaluation with a two-axis one. Axis 1 is the visible metric, what has been produced, when and how it ranks against external standards. Axis 2 is the interior metric, what has been understood, integrated, and genuinely changed by the process of building. The linear framework only sees Axis 1. You have been evaluating yourself exclusively on an axis that was designed to measure a different kind of development than the one you are undergoing. This does not mean Axis 1 does not matter. It does, but it is not the only axis, and applying only Axis 1 to a two-axis developmental pattern produces exactly the distorted picture you have been using to evaluate yourself as falling short. The second practical thing is more uncomfortable than the first, and it is also more important. You need to tell someone what you are building, not in the polished, presentable version that you offer to people whose judgment makes you anxious. In the actual version, the specific, uncertain, not yet complete version that lives in the part of your interior you have been protecting most carefully. Not because the telling will confirm the work or produce encouragement that changes the facts on the ground, because the act of putting the actual work into language with a person who can receive it honestly performs a specific psychological function that working in private cannot. Jung called this the function of witness, as the process by which an interior interior truth becomes more fully real through being named in the presence of another person. The late success type tends to work in extreme privacy, often out of a very reasonable protective instinct built around the experience of having shared unfinished work before and received a response that did not match what the work actually was. But long-term privacy can calcify into a kind of secrecy that is no longer protective and has become instead an additional layer of isolation around a process that is already isolated enough. Find one person, not an audience, one person, and tell them specifically and without the performance of confidence you do not currently have what you are actually building. The act itself, done once with genuine honesty, will change something in the interior relationship you have with your own process, not because of their response, because of what happens to you when you give your actual work the dignity of being spoken aloud. The third practical thing is also the most structurally important, and it is the one most late developers have to be explicitly given permission to do because nothing in their experience so far has given it to them. Stop measuring the quality of your process by the timeline of your output. These are genuinely separate things, and treating them as the same measurement is the primary way the linear framework does its most lasting damage to the people whose development does not follow the linear pattern. The quality of your process can be high, while the visible output remains low, not because you are failing to translate interior work into exterior product, but because the interior work is genuinely not finished yet, and producing output before the interior work is complete produces something you can see but cannot be proud of in the specific way you need to be proud of it. You know this. You have felt the difference between the thing you produced when you forced yourself to the timeline and the thing you produced when the timing was genuinely right. The difference is not subtle, and the version that came from the genuine timing is the one that had the quality. The version that was forced to the schedule produced the thing that looked right from the outside and felt hollow from the inside. Your body knows this. Your interior knows this. The only part that does not know it or refuses to trust it is the part that has absorbed the linear framework's insistence that timing is everything and earliness is virtue. Here is what I want to leave you with, not an instruction, not a reframe, something closer to a recognition that I think you have been waiting for longer than you realize. The person who succeeds late did not arrive late because they were slow. They arrived on a timeline that the world around them did not have the architecture to accommodate and the specific quality of what they built during the years when the world saw nothing as the exact quality that makes what eventually emerges from that process genuinely irreplaceable. Jung believed that the individuals who had undergone the most genuine individuation, who had done the hardest interior work rather than the most visible exterior work, were the ones who eventually offered the world the most that the world genuinely needed rather than the most that the world immediately recognized. Recognition is not the same as value. Arrival is not the same as worth. The silence during which you have been building is not evidence against you. It is the specific and demanding condition inside which the only kind of work you are genuinely capable of actually gets done. You were not built for the timeline they are measuring. You were built for the work that timeline cannot contain. And that work is not behind schedule. It is on yours.